speaker, Rachel Rush.
Good evening, ladies, gentlemen, and Madam Chairperson. The topic of this evening's debate is that New Zealand should become the 7th state of the Commonwealth of Australia. We, the affirmative team, believe this statement to be true, and I will be telling you why. But first, I will provide a definition and inform you of my team's points for this evening. We, the affirmative team, define the topic as the following. New Zealand and Australia are neighbouring countries in the North-South Pacific region. Become the 7th state of Australia means New Zealand joins the Commonwealth of Australia as a state with equal rights and responsibilities as all other Australian states. Tonight, I will tell you that our shared history and similar culture means it makes sense for us to combine our countries, that this will create greater equality for New Zealanders living in Australia, and the potential to bring about significant change in Indigenous policies in Australia. Our second speaker, Olivia, will be explaining how New Zealand and Australia would gain a bigger voice in world affairs, a stronger defence force would be formed, and how there would be significant economic benefits. Finally, our third speaker, Alex, will summarise our points for the evening. Now, to my first point. Australia and New Zealand have a shared history, culture, values, and aspirations. For example, both countries have a First Nations population and British colonial heritage, Anzac shared experiences, as well as similar popular culture and a love of the outdoors and sporting activities. We have similar values as well, such as democracy, freedom, and equality. We even have many things that we both claim as our own, such as pavlovas, flat whites, Russell Crowe, Keith Irwin, and lamingtons. Furthermore, we have common sporting interests, such as netball, rugby, soccer, and cricket. So imagine how good our sporting teams would be. Creating a united Australia-New Zealand entity with our shared culture would not be difficult. It will bring significant benefits that we will continue to explore during this debate. It just makes sense. Now, to my second point. Did you know that more New Zealanders live in Australia than Tasmanians? The June 2021 census showed that 558,000 Tasmanians live in Australia, as opposed to 560,000 New Zealanders. New Zealanders living in Australia must still pay taxes, but they do not get to vote for the people who run the country that they live in. They get some benefits, such as Medicare and pensions, but there are many catches around this. For example, they must live in Australia for more than 6 years before they are eligible for Medicare. They must live in Australia for 10 years to collect an aged pension. A further example is that tertiary students from New Zealand are considered domestic students, yet they cannot collect a student loan unless they complete their entire course while living in Australia or they hold a New Zealand special category visa. There are many opaque rules that disadvantage New Zealanders that would disappear if New Zealand was to become the 7th state of Australia. Greater equality would exist for all citizens. It just makes sense. Now, to my third and final point for the evening. Australia could adopt more sophisticated arrangements around that New Zealand has with its First Nations people. New Zealand has the Treaty of Waitangi with the Maori. The treaty protects Maori culture and gives them the ability to participate in political life. At the same time, the treaty gave the Crown the right to govern New Zealand and represent the interests of all New Zealanders. It makes sure that everyone is equal. But you might be thinking, why can't we implement these ideas without merging? Well, the answer is simple. Australia has tried many approaches before, but these attempts have not been very successful. The current voice referendum aims to give the Indigenous people a say in their affairs. However, a recent Guardian poll shows that 47% do not approve of the voice, with 43% in favour and the remaining 10% unsure. Most Aussies are hesitant about this because they doubt it would provide meaningful change, as stated by ABC News. If New Zealand did become the 7th state of Australia, 2 different approaches to First Nations issues could not be supported, and the New Zealand approach provides a more enlightened path. The New Zealand approach is a more developed and functional system, so that makes it the obvious choice. It just makes sense. In conclusion, as we navigate the complexities of the modern world, it is time to re-examine the possibilities offered by a closer relationship. I have provided examples of where New Zealanders would benefit as well as Australians. Building on our shared cultures, the New Zealand journey towards becoming the seventh state of Australia is a path worth exploring. It is not about each country diluting their culture and identity. Instead, it is one that could lead to a brighter and more secure future for both nations and the entire Asia-Pacific region. Thank you.
Call upon the first negative speaker, Jordan Lucas.
Good evening, Madam Chairman, ladies and gentlemen. The topic of our debate is that New Zealand should become the seventh state of the Commonwealth of Australia. We agree with the definition given by the affirmative team and would like to further define the term state as New Zealand formally being accepted as an Australian state with the Commonwealth of Australia, relinquishing its current status as an independent country and becoming an integral part of the Australian Federation. However, we contend that this union has such economic, legal, political and cultural complexities and that it is completely inadvisable and an unnecessary event. Before I present my arguments in detail, I will rebut the arguments of the first affirmative speaker. The first affirmative speaker said that the merge would bring greater rights to our First Nations people. This is irrelevant, as Australia needs to first solve the current issues that Australia has with its First Nations people, including the voice referendum. There are over 37,500 unsolved land disputes in Australia alone relating to First Nations people. Another red herring fallacy that was used is that the first affirmative speaker has used sport and food examples as an argument. These aspects of Australia are irrelevant to our debate and our definition. Today, as first speaker, I will be speaking about 3 points. Firstly, that New Zealand should not become the seventh state of Australia due to unnecessary economic and legal political complexities, because of political resistance of both countries, and lastly, due to issues of geography and distance. Our second speaker will be speaking about the many cultural issues which this unnecessary joining of the two countries will raise, the significant cultural resistance from both countries, and conclude that Australia has too many of its own cultural hurdles to overcome. And our third speaker will rebut and sum up our team case. And now to my first point, that New Zealand should not become the seventh state of the Commonwealth of Australia due to economic and legal political complexities. Both Australia and New Zealand have distinct legal, economic and political systems that have evolved independently for over a century. Joining New Zealand as a new state would necessitate a significant overhaul of Australia's constitutional framework, potentially leading to protracted legal battles and administrative challenges. During this time, the people of both nations will be neglected. Australian states are self-governing, with only some rules set by the federal government. Why would New Zealand bother to become the seventh state just to continue to be self-governed? New Zealand is identified as one of the world's most stable and well-governed countries. As of 2017, the country was ranked 4th in the strength of its democratic institutions. This progress and achievement will be completely disregarded if New Zealand is governed under the Australian constitutional laws, with potential unforeseen economic disparities jeopardising the stability. With a long history of self-governance and a distinct national identity, New Zealand becoming a state of Australia will require significant changes in both countries' political structures, and is a completely inadvisable and an unnecessary political path. And now to my second point, that New Zealand should not become the seventh state because of political resistance. Member for Parliament, Jamie Strange, directly stated that if we are to merge with the country of Australia, it will withdraw our independent voice in all international forums. New Zealand's political influence will be monitored by the federal government of Australia, causing unnecessary bureaucracy and red tape, which holds up progress and causes confusion. Likewise, Australia as a federation would face its own political resistance. The prospect of adding New Zealand as a seventh state would require significant constitutional changes and negotiations. This can trigger debates and disagreements within Australia about the potential impact on its federal system and certainly cultural issues that our second speaker will expand upon. Both countries could learn much more from the major complexities caused by UK and Europe, unifying and separating. If a similar Brexit-type separation happened, the political and economic fallout would unsettle the countries for years. For these reasons, we believe the merger is inadvisable and unnecessary, as the two countries already enjoy a mutual reciprocal relationship. And now to my last point, that New Zealand should not become the seventh state due to issues caused by geographical distance. The Tasman Sea that separates the two countries presents insurmountable challenges, despite any closer political and economic ties. Before Federation in 1901, Australia had invited New Zealand to join the Federation. New Zealand declined, with John Hall, a former Premier of New Zealand, citing distance as a deciding factor during a conference on Federation in Melbourne, Australia in 1890. He stated that democratic government must be a government, not only for the people, but by the people. But if it wants to be effective and give content, it must be in sight and within hearing of the people. Between New Zealand and Australia, New Zealand becoming the seventh state of Australia is not feasible due to the insurmountable distance that separates them. In conclusion, we resolutely believe that New Zealand should not become the seventh state of Australia because the issue is too complex and there are political, cultural, logistical and economic ramifications that are insurmountable, making it an inadvisable and an unnecessary path. Thank you.
I call upon the second affirmative speaker, Olivia Vasilek.
Good evening, Madam Chairperson, ladies and gentlemen. The topic of our debate is that New Zealand should become the seventh state of the Commonwealth of Australia. As the affirmative team, we will clearly explain why this is correct, but first I'll rebut the opposing team's points. The first negative speaker has stated that New Zealand joining Australia could complicate the constitutional framework that New Zealand already has developed. However, if New Zealand were to merge legal systems with Australia, this would lead to an increase in legal consistency and efficiency in New Zealand's constitutional framework. We agree that this process will be lengthy and complex, but the fact that this change would improve New Zealand's legal system makes the time that this process would take irrelevant. The first speaker has also stated that our countries are vastly different politically, and it would be incredibly difficult to change this. However, we do have different forms of government. However, it would be quite simple to merge our forms by simply taking their form of voting and making the two individual votes that they have, preferential voting or one form, could be chosen over the other. Our first speaker has already explained that it makes sense to unite our nations because of our shared history and traditions, that it would lead to greater equality for New Zealanders living in Australia, and that it has the potential to make a significant difference to Indigenous policy in Australia. My first point is that New Zealand becoming part of Australia would bring significant economic benefits to both the private and public sectors. In the private sector, for example, retailers such as Audi Australia would have fewer barriers to entering the New Zealand market, resulting in lower prices for basic goods for New Zealand customers. In addition, these two countries will reduce trade costs and increase economic integration, as supported by the Reserve Bank of Australia. The Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade says, The nation's economies would also immediately become more diversified. New Zealand into resources and Australia into dairy. It is vital to recognise that with the money that will be generated by the merger, public housing, COVID debt, homelessness, and so many other issues could be better targeted. The Lowy Institute also supports this economic union, stating that merging the Australian and New Zealand economies will improve diversity and homogeneity and make the larger economy more competitive. Moving on to my second point. The union of New Zealand with Australia would strengthen New Zealand's global position. The Guardian suggests that a union between Australia and New Zealand would have several geopolitical benefits. For example, combining the economic, political, and military strengths of Australia and New Zealand will give both countries greater regional and global influence. This will give the union greater bargaining power and influence in regional and global affairs. Together, Australia and New Zealand would have greater diplomatic presence around the world. This will enable them to work together more effectively on international issues, promoting common interests and contributing to global problem-solving efforts. The political union will also lead to more synchronized foreign policies, coordinated responses to international issues and crises, and enhanced diplomatic efforts. The Sydney Morning Herald supports this view, arguing that a united Australia and New Zealand could play a greater role in promoting stability and development in the South Pacific region, reducing the risk of conflict or political instability in neighbouring countries. A union would also enable a more rapid and coordinated response to natural disasters or other crises in the region. My third and final point is that it would be highly beneficial for both countries to combine their defence forces. This would be a very powerful Anzac-inspired move. The Anzac portal reminds us that Australia and New Zealand have a proud history of joint operations, dating back to the Australian and New Zealand Army Corps at Gallipoli in 1914. This rich tradition of military cooperation has proven highly successful. So why don't we consider the long-term benefits of formalising this alliance? NationalMaester.com explains that New Zealand's military will benefit significantly from joining Australia. The 9,000-strong New Zealand Defence Force will join the 6 times larger Australian Army, providing stronger defence for both countries. In conclusion, I would like to reiterate that New Zealand becoming the 7th state of Australia would bring economic, geopolitical, and military benefits. This union would enable advancements in critical areas like housing and international diplomacy that would otherwise be left beyond reach. Moreover, both countries would be better positioned to secure their shared future with a more extensive and robust defence force. Thank you.
Call upon the second negative speaker, Natika Vivian.
Good evening, Madam Chairman, ladies and gentlemen. As you are aware, the topic for our debate tonight is that New Zealand should become the 7th state of the Commonwealth of Australia. Our first speaker has already spoken to you about the economic and political complexities of merging the 2 Commonwealth countries, and because of the issues of geographically governing a distant state is difficult. Tonight, as second speaker, I will be debating that New Zealand should not become the 7th state of the Commonwealth because there are many cultural issues which this unnecessary joining of the 2 countries will raise due to the significant cultural resistance, and I'll conclude that Australia has too many of its own cultural hurdles to overcome. Our third speaker will rebut and sum up our team case. Before I present my arguments in detail, I will rebut the arguments of the first and second speakers from the affirmative team. The second speaker of the affirmative team has said that Australia's military would benefit from the merge. This is false, as Australia's military would only grow by a maximum of 10%. Similarly, New Zealand simply has no need for Australia's military, as New Zealand's own military is well suited to address the nation's defence needs without relying on Australia. To continue, New Zealand is already in many regional defence alliances with Australia, such as the Five Eyes Intelligence Alliance. Merging with Australia would be simply unnecessary. And now to my first point, that New Zealand should not become the seventh state of the Commonwealth because there are too many cultural issues to contend with to join the country successfully. There were many perceptions that the Indigenous Maori population would suffer as a result of the merger, and New Zealand and Australia, and that they would be treated badly. Australia has a very different relationship with their First Nations people in comparison to New Zealand. The Guardian article says Maori people might be the luckiest Indigenous people, since they make up more than 15% of the New Zealand population, which is more than 5 times larger than the First Nations of Australia. The First Nations people of New Zealand have had a treaty signed since 1840, the Treaty of Waitangi, and have always respected the opinions of the Maori people in governing the country. Australia is one of the only Commonwealth countries to still not have a treaty with their First Nations people. The Guardian also states that there are over 37,000 unresolved Aboriginal land claims in New South Wales, awaiting determination by the government. With people of First Nations backgrounds still fighting for land rights, with two such opposed cultural perspectives, it will be incredibly difficult to join two culturally diverse nations. And now to my second point, that New Zealand should not become the seventh state of the Commonwealth, because there will be significant cultural resistance from both countries that strays into the political realm. The Maori people are in a better position than Australia's Indigenous people, with guaranteed representation in Parliament and local government through designated seats, dedicated TV channels and radio stations. They are prioritised much higher than Australia's First Nations people. It would jeopardise its position if they joined Australia and lost their cultural identity. If New Zealand became the seventh state, based on population, New Zealand would be entitled to about 1/6 of the seats in Australian House of Representatives, which would not be the case under a joint parliament, reducing the Maori status and causing resistance to the merger. Cultural insecurity is real amongst First Nations people when they live with migrant populations. Today in Australia, opinion polls are showing the proposed Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander voice to Parliament doesn't have the support it needs to pass a referendum later this year. According to The Guardian newspaper, A Current Affair and ABC, the Australian voice referendum has a 62% chance to not pass. The tone of this debate shows just how differently Australia and New Zealand think about such issues with likely resistance. And now to my final point, that Australia has too many of its own cultural hurdles to overcome without integrating any others. Australia wanted New Zealand to federate in 1901, seeking a racially discriminatory state. Why Australia? New Zealand was hesitant because of its Maori population and declined. Those different approaches have reverberated across the decades. Australians will have their say about Aboriginal representation in government in an October 14 referendum known as The Voice. In New Zealand, however, Maori are already represented in Parliament through designated seats. On the same day as the Australian referendum, a general election will take place in New Zealand where Indigenous voters will have the opportunity to vote in electorates that are reserved for Maori representatives. They have been able to do this since 1867. We are centuries behind, showing that Australia has too many of its own cultural hurdles to overcome. And so, ladies and gentlemen, in conclusion, we, the Negative team, resolutely believe that New Zealand should not become the seventh state of the Commonwealth of Australia. As we have shown you, this union is complex and multifaceted, involving economic, political, cultural and logistical considerations. It would require careful deliberation and likely a public referendum to determine the will of the New Zealand people. These are insurmountable, making it an inadvisable and unnecessary path. Thank you.
I call upon the third affirmative speaker, Alex Peck.
Good evening, ladies, gentlemen, and Madam Chairperson. The topic for this evening's debate is that New Zealand should become the seventh state of the Australian Commonwealth, and we, the affirmative team, strongly believe this statement to be true. As the third speaker for this evening's debate, I'll be summarising my team's speeches. However, I will first offer rebuttals against many of the negative team's points. The first negative speaker stated that we should not talk about the Maori people's benefits, as we have too many problems of our own. However, we can use their incredible relationship with the Maori people to learn from them and solve the many issues stated with our Indigenous Australians. The negative side's concern about preserving New Zealand's unique cultural identity is important, but becoming a state does not necessarily mean cultural homogenisation. Countries like Canada and Australia themselves have diverse regional cultures within their federal systems. New Zealand can retain and even celebrate its unique cultural identity within a federal framework. The first negative speaker has stated that New Zealand is geographically isolated from Australia, making it difficult for agriculture and trade to continue if New Zealand becomes Australia's seventh state. However, New Zealand's market could expand if it becomes a part of Australia, and the trade barriers between Australia and New Zealand could reduce for the trade and agricultural industries. The geographical isolation between New Zealand and Australia is a minor issue when it comes down to benefits for the agricultural and trade industries. The first negative speaker has said that New Zealand had the opportunity to join previously and they chose not to. However, this was a long time ago, and since then, both countries and their circumstances have changed. The first negative speaker stated that New Zealand is too far and separate from Australia to become one of the states. Using the Qantas Airlines website, it is clear to see that from the eastern states of Australia, it is farther to Perth than it is to New Zealand's capital city of Wellington. This just comes to show that it would be, in fact, closer to travel to their capital city than it would to one of our already existing states' capital cities, reversing the point, just proving how close and simple it is to travel from Australia to New Zealand, making it a perfect candidate for our seventh state. The first speaker said the main reason that New Zealand originally declined was due to distance. This is false. It was due to the racism that Australia had at the time. This has now cleared up since. The second negative speaker has tried to tell you that New Zealand's cultural identity will be diluted if they join Australia. However, this is incorrect because cultural diversity can be preserved within a federal system. New Zealand's cultural identity is strong enough to remain distinct even if they join Australia. They would have a rich history and unique traditions that would continue to be celebrated. The negative team has also stated that New Zealand do not need a larger defence force as they already have a highly formidable one of their own. While New Zealand does have a strong defence partnerships, full political integration could enhance security by allowing for more coordinated and efficient defence efforts. New Zealand would still have a say in its defence policies and contributions, while benefiting from a more unified approach to regional security. The second speaker has stated that there has been a lack of public support for the idea of this change. However, originally Italy was a collection of separate states and regions before it became a union. And the idea of these states and regions The idea of these states and regions together forming Italy received heavy backlash from the public. Though without this change, we wouldn't have the country known as Italy today, playing a significant role in the cultural and politics of Europe. Who's to say that this change won't bring the same positive effect with Italy? Now to our summary. Our first speaker for this evening's debate, Rachel, stated that New Zealand and Australia have similar cultures between our Indigenous people and that we can learn from the many improvements that New Zealand have over us to represent them more. She also stated that New Zealand created a formal agreement named the Treaty of Waitangi to accept and honour the Maori people of the past, present and future. With the hundreds of thousands of New Zealanders already living in Australia, which is more than there are Tasmanians. It would be rational to officially unite and form one country under the Australian name. And finally, Australia and New Zealand already share highly similar history, culture, values, and aspirations, making them what you might call the perfect candidate to unite with us. Moving on to our second speaker for this evening, Olivia, who spoke about how New Zealand becoming the seventh state of Australia would bring economic, geopolitical, and military benefits. We would be less likely to be invaded, and it would be highly beneficial for us if we wanted to help defend other countries. This union would also enable advancements in critical areas, such as housing and international diplomacy, that would otherwise remain beyond reach. This would increase our ability to grow as a union and create much more stability for our country. With all of these considered, I hope you agree. Thank you.
I call upon the third negative speaker, Cynthia Zhang.
Good evening, Madam Chairman, ladies and gentlemen. The topic for our debate tonight is that New Zealand should become the seventh state of the Commonwealth of Australia. Tonight, you have heard how New Zealand becoming an Australian state is a horrible decision because of the cultural, legal, political, economical, and geographical differences, and merging the two would be completely inadvisable and unnecessary. Before I conclude our debate on this topic, I will rebut the opposition's arguments. The first and third speaker said that New Zealand's treatment of Maori people would carry into wider Australia. This is partially a hasty generalisation fallacy, as there is nothing supporting this claim, and it has been proven untrue. States do not have influence over general Australia. Victoria has their own curriculum that does not carry over to general Australia. The equal treatment of the First Nations people would not carry over. The first speaker of the affirmative team has also tried to tell you that they have similar cultures and values. This is untrue, as having common values and backgrounds is not enough to merge two separate political entities. For example, despite China and Taiwan sharing a common cultural and historical background, they have distinct political entities and engage separately in international organizations and diplomatic relations. This demonstrates that even shared heritage does not always lead to political alignment. The first speaker also said that New Zealanders in Australia do not have the same rights as Aussies. This may be true, but is, in fact, irrelevant. The Australian Bureau of Statistics has stated that over 52% of Australia residing New Zealanders plan on returning to New Zealand. Similarly, Australia has many other residents that do not hold Australian passports, around a fifth of the population. These Australians would not benefit and could be hindered due to the different resource allocation. The second speaker said that it is not difficult to merge New Zealand and Australia, and would recognise how merging was detrimental during the merging process. This is incorrect, as many examples have shown the potential issues of merging nations. Take Brexit. The UK's withdrawal from Europe has caused significant cultural and complex political issues. 7 years later, these effects are still felt across Europe and the UK. They did not realise the detriment being part of Europe until later. The second speaker of the affirmative team has also tried to tell you that merging could amplify the influence of both New Zealand and Australia. While this may sound promising, historical examples from international alliances suggest that shared representation does not always guarantee amplified influence. Take the case of the European Union. Despite its significant collective responses, the EU often struggles to achieve unanimous foreign policy decisions due to varying priorities among member states, resulting in delayed or fragmented responses to global issues. The joint representation of New Zealand and Australia raises the issue of having to navigate complex foreign policies and strategies, hindering their ability to act cohesively and therefore diluting their overall influence. The second speaker also said New Zealand would benefit from the merged legal systems. This is simply not true. New Zealand's government is globally recognised as the first ranking in transparency. Australia's government, on the other hand, is infamous for the inefficiency. To continue, this would erase their own national identity, like replacing the Maori-chosen New Zealand flag. The third affirmative speaker has also used a hasty generalisation to persuade you. She has stated that it is closer to the capital of New Zealand than to Perth. However, this depends where in Australia you reside. Thus, this conclusion on this matter uses solely this fact to draw it. The third speaker said that merging the countries would have economic and trade benefits. This is untrue, as merging with Australia could make New Zealand more economically dependent on its larger neighbour. Take when Germany reunified. The cost of living in East Germany was significantly raised due to the sudden influx of Western goods and services, disrupting the local economy. If this merger happened 10 years ago, when Australia had a mining boom, increasing the currency from 70 cents to $1.10, New Zealand's economy would be devastated. Their exports would become 50% more expensive. And why would their biggest consumer, America, buy their products when New Zealand's currency is worth more than theirs? Our first speaker has spoken to you about the economic and legal political complexities of merging the two Commonwealth countries, and the incredible likely political resistance and issues of geography and distance which make governing a distant state impossible. Our second speaker spoke about the numerous cultural issues that would inevitably arise, hindering the process of integrating New Zealand as an Australian state, and also about almost certain significant cultural resistance that both countries will display, and Australia's own significant cultural hurdles. And so, ladies and gentlemen, there are countless detrimental political, cultural, and economic impacts of New Zealand becoming the seventh state of Australia. Not only would merging the countries be unwise, but also utterly unnecessary.